The winter gets colder. The snow buries the roof. You still want to stay?
You don't know true isolation until you've sat on a splintering train platform in a dress you can't breathe in, waiting for a husband who isn't coming. The wind bites. The station master stares. And then, the wrong man walks out of the timberline. The wooden bench at the Oak Haven depot was rotting. Cora knew this because she had been sitting on it for 9 hours, and the damp decay had entirely seeped through her wool skirt. The train had hissed away into the gray valley at dawn, leaving behind a thick cloud of sulfur and coal dust that still seemed to coat the inside of her mouth. She had a trunk, $2, and a piece of paper bearing the name Arthur Pendleton. According to the letters in her carpet bag, Arthur was a prosperous cattleman. He had a warm hearth, a steady hand, and a need for a quiet wife. Cora was quiet. She had to be. New York didn't leave much room for a woman with no money and a loud mouth to survive, so she had packed her life into 20 pounds of canvas and leather and boarded a train west. But Arthur wasn't here. The sky above Oak Haven was the color of a bruised knee, heavy with impending snow. The town itself was barely a town, just a muddy thoroughfare lined with false front buildings, a saloon that smelled of stale beer even from the platform, and the depot. "I'm locking up, miss," the station master said. He was a small, wire-thin man with tobacco stains in his gray beard. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her like she was a stray dog he was going to have to shoot if she didn't wander off. "Mr. Pendleton sent a telegram," Cora said. Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard, tasting grit. "He said he would be here." The station master unhooked a heavy ring of iron keys from his belt. "Arthur Pendleton died Tuesday. Heart gave out while he was pulling a calf out of the mud. Town buried him Thursday." The words didn't register as a tragedy. They registered as a physical blow to her stomach. Cora simply stared at the man's scuffed leather boots. Tuesday. She had been crossing the plains on Tuesday, dreaming of a hearth she would never see. "I have nowhere to go," she stated. It wasn't a plea. It was a mathematical fact. Boarding house is full up with miners. Saloons got rooms, but you don't strike me as a saloon girl. The station master rattled his keys. "Next train back east ain't for 3 weeks. You can't stay on this platform. You'll freeze before midnight." Panic, cold and sharp, finally began to claw its way up her throat. She gripped the handle of her carpet bag until her knuckles turned white. Her corset, laced tight for a husband who was already decaying in the ground, suddenly felt like an iron cage. She couldn't breathe. Heavy footsteps on the boardwalk broke the silence. Cora looked up. The man walking toward the depot didn't look like a cattleman or a miner. He looked like the mountain itself had spat him out. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, wearing a coat made of thick, poorly tanned elk hide. His boots were caked in dried red mud. He carried a burlap sack over one shoulder, smelling strongly of raw onions, damp wool, and smoked meat. "Need my freight, Miller," the man said. His voice was like a shovel scraping over gravel. Deep, resonant, entirely devoid of pleasantry. "You're late, Caleb," the station master grunted, moving toward the freight room. "Been sitting on your salt and kerosene for a week?" River flooded. Trail washed out. Caleb set his sack down. He didn't look at Cora. He didn't look at anything except the padlocked door of the freight room. He was younger than Cora would have guessed from a distance, maybe 30, but his face was weathered, mapped with fine lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun and snow. He had a jagged, pale scar cutting through the dark scruff on his jaw. His hands were massive, the knuckles scarred and the fingernails black with dirt. "Got a problem out here, Caleb," Miller said, hauling out a wooden crate of kerosene. He jerked his chin toward Cora. "Pendleton's mail-order bride. Pendleton's dead." Caleb finally turned his head. His eyes were a startling pale gray, like river stones under running water. He looked at her. He took in her ridiculous, impractical, plum-colored traveling dress. He took in the ridiculous feathered hat pinned to her hair. He took in her shivering. He looked away. "Not my problem," Caleb said, hoisting the kerosene crate onto his opposite shoulder. "She ain't got money for a room," Miller pressed, wiping his hands on his trousers. "She's gonna freeze on my platform, and the sheriff's gonna make me dig the grave." Caleb stopped. He turned slowly, the heavy crate balancing effortlessly on his shoulder. "She can go to the church. Roof caved in from the snow last month. Ain't fixed yet." Caleb swore. It was a low, ugly word. He stared at the muddy floorboards, a muscle jumping in his jaw. He clearly wanted to walk away. The cynical part of Cora's brain, the part that had kept her alive in the city slums, knew he would. Men didn't take on burdens that didn't benefit them. Then, Caleb dropped the crate back onto the platform with a heavy thud. He walked over to Cora. Up close, he smelled intensely of pine resin, sweat, and something feral and metallic. Blood, maybe. Animal blood. You know how to cook, he asked. Cora blinked. Yes. You know how to skin a rabbit? No. Caleb sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. My pa's old cabin is 3 miles up the ridge. I live in the main one, 50 yards away. The old cabin's empty. It's got a stove and firewood. You stay there until the train comes back in 3 weeks. You don't bother me. I don't bother you. You cook my suppers. I give you rations. It wasn't a proposal. It was a transactional decree from a man who found her presence deeply inconvenient, but couldn't stomach leaving a woman to freeze on a train platform. Cora looked out at the muddy, desolate street of Oakhaven. The wind howled, rattling the tin roof of the depot. She looked back at the mountain man. He was terrifying. He was filthy. I'll need help with my trunk, she said, her voice shaking only a fraction. Caleb looked at the massive, iron-banded trunk. He looked back at her. I ain't a pack mule. Take what you can carry. The rest stays. Before she could argue, he hoisted his kerosene and onions, turned his back, and started walking toward the edge of town. Cora scrambled. She opened the trunk, tearing through neatly folded linens and keepsakes she had thought would furnish her new, respectable life. She grabbed a heavy woolen shawl, 2 extra pairs of stockings, her mother's cast-iron skillet, and shoved them into her carpet bag. She locked the trunk, abandoning the rest of her past on the platform. She ran to catch up with him, her thin leather shoes already sinking into the freezing mud. The first mile was a humiliating agony. Cora's plum-colored dress, made of heavy cotton velvet, became an absolute trap. The hem soaked up the wet snow and mud like a sponge, adding 5 pounds of dead weight to her legs. Her corset bit into her ribs with every ragged breath. The mountain air was brutally thin, tasting like crushed ice and iron. Caleb walked 10 paces ahead. He never slowed down. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He moved with a heavy, rolling gait that ate up the steep, rocky terrain with infuriating ease. He had a pack mule waiting at the edge of the tree line. The animal was ill-tempered and missing half its left ear. Caleb tied the kerosene and onions to the pack saddle, but he didn't offer her a ride. He simply clicked his tongue, and the mule followed him up the narrow, winding game trail. Wait! Cora gasped, tripping over an exposed root. She went down hard, her knees hitting the frozen earth. Caleb stopped. He turned slowly, holding the mule's lead rope. He didn't rush to her. He didn't offer his hand. He just watched her struggle back to her feet, her gloves stained black with wet soil. You're making too much noise, he said quietly. Cora felt a hot flush of anger burn through the icy numbness in her cheeks. I'm sorry if my freezing to death is disturbing the peace. It is, he replied, entirely serious. There's a cougar tracking the ridge. She smells the salt on the mule. You flailing around like a wounded bird just makes us a target. Cora froze. She looked into the dense, dark green wall of pine trees on either side of the trail. The shadows seemed to stretch and contort. The wind shifted, and she heard a low, distant snapping of branches. Caleb unslung a heavy, worn Winchester rifle from his shoulder. He didn't cock it, but he held it comfortably across his chest. Walk in my footprints. Step where I step. Breathe through your nose, not your mouth. It keeps the cold out of your lungs. He turned back around. Cora swallowed her pride, her anger, and her fear. She focused her eyes squarely on the back of his elk-hide coat. She watched his boots. He wore thick leather boots laced up to his calves, the soles studded with iron hobnails. He stepped on solid rock. She stepped on solid rock. He avoided a patch of slick black ice. She avoided it. By the second mile, the physical pain was a white-hot roar in her ears. Her toes had completely lost sensation. The carpet bag tore at her shoulder. She wanted to sit down. She wanted to curl up in the snow and sleep. The urge was seductive, heavy, and warm. Just close your eyes for a minute, her tired brain whispered. She stumbled, her ankle rolling on a loose stone. This time, she didn't catch herself. She pitched forward, bracing for the impact of the ice. It never came. A hand clamped onto her upper arm, stopping her fall with a jolt that rattled her teeth. Caleb had dropped the mule's lead and closed the distance between them with terrifying speed. His grip was like a vice, bruising and entirely devoid of gentleness. He hauled her upright. His gray eyes were inches from hers. Up close, the scar on his jaw was jagged and raised, pink against the cold skin. He smelled of sweat and that deep, earthy musk of the woods. Don't sit down, he ordered, his voice low. You sit down out here. You don't get back up. I can't, she breathed, her lips numb. My shoes. I can't feel my feet. Caleb looked down at her feet. He let out a harsh breath through his nose, a sound of profound irritation. He unbuttoned the front of his heavy coat. Beneath it, he wore a rough wool sweater. He reached around to the back of his belt and unrolled a thick, heavily cured bear hide he had tied there. He threw it over her shoulders. It was heavy, weighing at least 20 pounds, and it smelled distinctly of old grease and dust. But the moment it settled around her, it trapped what little body heat she had left. Last mile, he said, stepping back. He didn't offer his arm. He just pointed up the trail. They reached the clearing just as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, plunging the world into a deep, bruised twilight. The temperature plummeted instantly. There were two structures. One was a sturdy, well-built log cabin with smoke lazily curling from a stone chimney. The other, 50 yards away through knee-deep snow, was smaller, older, the wood gray and weathered. Caleb walked to the smaller cabin and kicked the door open. It groaned on rusted hinges. He stepped inside and struck a match. Cora stood in the doorway, clutching the bear hide. The flare of the match revealed a single room. The floor was packed dirt. There was a rusted iron stove in the corner, a small table made of rough-hewn planks, and a bed frame strung with rope in the opposite corner. A thin mattress, stuffed with what looked like dry pine needles and straw, lay on the ropes. There were no curtains. The walls were chinked with dry mud. It was desolate. It was primitive. Caleb lit a kerosene lantern on the table. The yellow light threw long, harsh shadows across his face. He walked to the corner, picked up an armful of split wood from a pile, and shoved it into the stove. He didn't ask her if she was comfortable. He didn't apologize for the state of the place. He poured kerosene over the wood and tossed a match in. The fire caught with a muffled whump. Matches are in the tin on the table. Wood's outside, he said, staring into the flames as they licked against the iron door. Don't burn the place down. He walked past her, pausing in the doorway. He looked at her, standing there in her ruined plum dress, shivering under a dead bear. I'll bring beans and flour in the morning, he said. And then he walked out, pulling the door shut with a solid echoing thud. Cora stood in the center of the dirt floor, the silence of the mountain pressed against the thin glass of the window, heavier than the roar of the city had ever been. She dropped her carpet bag. She walked to the stove, peeled off her soaking leather shoes, and sat on the dirt, pressing her frozen toes as close to the warming iron as she dared. She didn't cry. Crying wasted water, and she didn't know where the well was. She just watched the fire, realizing with a cold clarity that Arthur Pendleton's death wasn't the worst thing that could have happened to her. Surviving Caleb Jessup might be. The morning sun hit the window pane like a physical assault, glaring off the unbroken expanse of snow outside. Cora woke shivering. The stove had died somewhere in the night. The draft slipping through the chinks in the logs carried a bitter, stinging frost. Her bones ached in a way she hadn't thought possible, a deep, marrow-deep throb from the hike and the cold. She threw off the bear hide and stood up. Her plum dress, which she had slept in, was stiff with dried mud at the hem. Her hair, once pinned in neat, respectable coils, hung in tangled, oily strands around her face. She walked to the small bucket of water resting near the stove. A thin layer of ice had formed over the top. She broke it with her knuckle and splashed the freezing water on her face, gasping at the shock. You cook my suppers, I give you rations. That was the deal. She was not a guest, she was an employee. If she wanted to stay under this roof until the train returned, she had to prove she wasn't entirely useless. She laced up her ruined shoes, wrapped her shawl tight, and pushed the door open. The air was so crisp it burned her nostrils. The sky was an impossible, violent blue. Across the 50 yards of snow, Caleb's main cabin stood silent. There was no smoke from his chimney. He was already gone. Cora found the supplies he had left on her small porch. A sack of flour, a small tin of lard, a jar of what looked like sourdough starter, and a hunk of salted pork wrapped in brown paper. It was a meager, rough haul. She carried the supplies inside and began to rebuild the fire. It took her 4 matches and a lot of frustrated swearing words she had never used in New York before the damp wood caught. She decided to make biscuits. It was simple. It was filling. She found an old cast-iron skillet hanging on the wall, heavy and black with years of use. She mixed the flour, lard, and water in a chipped wooden bowl. She wasn't entirely sure how to use the sourdough starter, so she poured a generous glug of the sour, fermenting liquid into the dough. She set the skillet directly onto the flat top of the stove. She waited for it to get hot, then dropped lumps of the dough into the dry iron. Within minutes, the cabin filled with a acrid, choking smoke. Cora coughed, waving her hands wildly as the dough sizzled and blackened against the iron. She hadn't greased the pan. She grabbed the handle of the skillet to move it off the heat, entirely forgetting that solid iron conducts heat perfectly. The burn was immediate and blinding. Ah! Cora dropped the heavy pan. It clattered against the iron stove and slid off, crashing onto the dirt floor. The blackened, smoking husks of dough scattered in the dust. She clutched her right hand to her chest, tears springing to her eyes as the skin across her palm throbbed with a vicious, searing heat. The door opened. Caleb stood in the frame, blocking the sunlight. He was holding a dead rabbit by the hind legs. He looked at the smoke filling the room. He looked at the overturned skillet. He looked at the ruined biscuits in the dirt. Finally, his eyes settled on Cora, who was backed against the far wall, cradling her hand, her chest heaving. For a long, terrible second, neither of them moved. In Cora's world, in the alleys and tenements she had clawed her way out of, a ruined meal and a broken routine meant violence. It meant a backhand or a belt. She instinctively shrank back, bracing herself, waiting for the explosion of anger. Caleb walked inside. He dropped the rabbit on the wooden table with a wet, heavy thud. He didn't yell. His face betrayed absolutely nothing. He walked past her to the stove, picked up the hot skillet by the handle using a thick leather glove he pulled from his belt, and set it back on top. He kicked the burned biscuits into the corner with his boot. Then, he turned to her. "Let me see," he said. His voice was gravelly, quiet. Cora shook her head, pressing her hand tighter to her chest. "I'm fine. I'm sorry. I didn't grease the pan. I can clean it." Caleb closed the distance between them. He didn't ask again. He reached out and wrapped his massive, rough hand around her wrist. His grip was firm, inescapable, but he didn't pull her violently. He just held her arm in place and gently peeled her fingers back. A stark, angry red blister was already rising diagonally across her palm. Caleb let out a slow breath. He dropped her wrist. "Sit down." He walked to a small shelf near the window, rummaged through a pile of rusted tins, and pulled out a small glass jar filled with a thick, greenish paste. He brought it to the table, pulled out a wooden chair, and pointed at it. Cora sat. She was trembling, entirely disoriented by the lack of screaming. Caleb pulled up a stool opposite her. He opened the jar. The smell hit her. Instantly mint, pine sap, and something harshly medicinal that made her eyes water. He scooped a dollop of the paste onto his thick index finger. "This is going to sting," he said. He didn't look at her face. He looked only at the burn. He applied the paste. The sting was sharp like a bee sting, but it was quickly followed by a deep, numbing cold that leached the fire out of her skin. His touch was an absolute contradiction. His hands were brutal, scarred, calloused, the knuckles thick and hard. Yet, the way he spread the salve was methodical and surprisingly light. "You don't put dry dough on hot iron," he muttered, still not making eye contact. "You need fat, bacon grease, lard." "I know," Cora whispered, feeling suddenly very small and very foolish. "I wasn't thinking." "You weren't thinking?" Caleb agreed bluntly. He wiped the excess salve on his trouser leg. "Up here, you don't think? You lose a hand to frostbite. You don't think? You burn your shelter down. You don't think? You die." He finally looked up. His gray eyes locked onto hers. There was no pity in them. There was only the hard, unyielding truth of a man who survived by trusting nothing but his own competence. "I'm not a maid," Cora said, a defensive edge creeping into her voice despite the throbbing in her hand. "I lived in a city. I cooked on a gas range. I don't know how to live in the dirt." "Then you better learn fast," Caleb said. He stood up, towering over her. He nodded toward the dead rabbit on the table. "Because I brought the meat, and I'm not cooking it." He turned and walked toward the door. "I don't know how to clean that," Cora blurted out, panic rising again as she looked at the blood matting the rabbit's fur. Caleb paused with his hand on the door latch. He looked back over his shoulder. He looked at the dead rabbit, then at Cora's bandaged, useless hand, then at her ruined plum dress. A muscle in his jaw twitched. For a brief second, she thought he might actually laugh, but the expression died before it reached his eyes. "Come to my cabin in an hour," he said, his voice flat. "I'll show you how to skin a carcass." He walked out, shutting the door. Cora sat alone in the dim, smoky cabin. Her hand throbbed. The fire popped, spitting sap against the iron. She looked at the dead rabbit. She looked at the door. She was trapped on a mountain with a man who was more animal than human, who didn't want her there, and who had just bandaged her hand instead of hitting her. She took a slow, deep breath, smelling the pine sap on her palm. It smelled better than the train smoke. She stood up, walked to her carpet bag, and dug out an old, faded apron. She tied it over the ruined plum dress. It was time to learn how to skin a rabbit. Caleb's cabin smelled of gun oil, wood smoke, and curing leather. It was meticulously clean, a stark contrast to the feral nature of the man who lived in it. Traps hung in organized rows along the log walls. A heavy iron kettle simmered over a stone hearth, radiating a dry, localized heat. Cora stood just inside the threshold, her burnt hand tucked into the pocket of her apron. Caleb didn't look up when she entered. He was standing at a heavy wooden table, wiping down the blade of a skinning knife with a stained rag. The dead rabbit lay before him. "Step up," he commanded. Cora walked forward. The metallic tang of fresh blood hit the back of her throat, thick and nauseating. She clamped her jaw shut, refusing to let him see her gag. "Watch," Caleb said. He took the rabbit by the loose skin of its back. His movements were frighteningly economical. He made a shallow incision near the hind legs, the blade slipping under the fur with a wet, ripping sound. He didn't hesitate. He pulled the hide down like a glove, turning inside out. The flesh beneath was slick, deep red, and steaming faintly in the cool air of the cabin. Cora stared, her stomach performing a slow, miserable roll. It was brutal. It was entirely necessary. He finished the task in under a minute, tossing the discarded pelt into a wooden bucket. He wiped his hands on a rag, picked up a second, smaller rabbit from a burlap sack on the floor, and set it on the table. He laid the knife beside it. The handle, made of carved bone, was still stained with red fingerprints. "Your turn," he said. Cora looked at the knife, then at her right hand, where the blister throbbed angrily under the paste. She reached out with her left hand. It was awkward, trembling, and entirely devoid of strength. She pressed the blade to the rabbit's hind leg. It didn't cut. She pressed harder, the blade slipping awkwardly against the fur. Caleb let out a short, harsh breath. He stepped behind her. He didn't ask for permission. He reached around her, his massive chest brushing against her back, and covered her trembling left hand with his right. His grip was hot and rough, his calluses scraping against her knuckles. He smelled of pine needles and dried sweat. "You don't hack at it," he muttered, his voice a low rumble right next to her ear. "You find the membrane. The knife does the work. You just guide it." He applied pressure. The blade bit into the flesh. Cora gasped at the sudden, slick parting of the skin, the warmth of the dead animal seeping through the metal and bone directly into her palm. Together they pulled the knife down. It wasn't romantic. It was a shared butchery. Cora's breathing hitched, shallow and panicked, but Caleb's breathing was slow, steady, anchoring her to the dirt floor. When the hide finally tore away, her hands were slick with blood. She dropped the knife. It clattered against the wood. She stepped back, wiping her bloody left hand desperately on her apron, her chest heaving. Caleb picked up the knife. He didn't mock her. He just began to quarter the meat. Cora walked to the wash basin in the corner to scrub her hand. As she reached for the rough lye soap, her eyes fell on a small leather-bound book sitting on a shelf. The leather was cracked, but the gold foil stamped into the spine caught the firelight. Holy Bible. Property of Arthur Pendleton. Cora froze. The cold water dripped from her fingers, turning the dust on the floor into dark mud. She looked at the book, then slowly turned her head to look at the broad, scarred back of the mountain man. "Arthur Pendleton," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the quiet cabin, it sounded like a gunshot. Caleb's knife stopped moving. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with sudden, volatile tension. He set the blade down very slowly. He turned around. The firelight caught the jagged scar on his jaw, making it look violently red. "He was my father," Caleb said. There was no grief in his voice. There was only ash. Cora's mind spun, trying to reconcile the wealthy, respectable cattleman from her letters with the terrifying, isolated man standing before her. "Your name is Jessup." "My mother's name," Caleb corrected, his tone flat. He picked up a rag and began to wipe the blood from his fingers. "She ran off when I was 10. Took me as far as the mining camps before the consumption drowned her lungs. I came back to the mountain." "Not to him." He threw the bloodied rag onto the table. Arthur Pendleton didn't want a son. He wanted a ranch hand he didn't have to pay. When I got big enough to hit back, he threw me out. Built this cabin myself. Caleb looked at her, his pale gray eyes stripping away her polite defenses. He wrote you letters, I imagine, told you about his big house, his warm hearth. Cora swallowed hard. Yes. The house burned down 3 years ago. He was living in a sod dugout behind the livery in town, drinking away the last of his cattle money. He didn't want a wife, Cora. He wanted a nursemaid who was too poor to leave. The reality of it hit her like a physical blow. The respectable life she had crossed a continent for was a fiction. Arthur Pendleton had been a desperate, dying man looking to buy a servant. She hadn't just lost a husband. She had narrowly escaped a slow, miserable death in a sod hut. She looked at Caleb. She saw the defensive set of his shoulders, the wary, cynical tightening of his jaw. He expected her to weep. He expected her to break. Instead, a strange, hollow laugh scraped its way out of her throat. It was bitter and entirely unladylike. I bought a plum velvet dress for a man who lived in a hole in the ground, she whispered, staring at the blood on her apron. Caleb watched her. Slowly, the tight lines of his face relaxed. The corner of his mouth twitched. Just a fraction. It wasn't a smile, but it was an acknowledgement. Velvet's a fool's fabric out here, he agreed quietly. Gets heavy in the snow. I know, Cora said, looking up at him. The fear was gone, replaced by a raw, exhausted clarity. I'll wear wool tomorrow. 3 weeks changed a woman. The plum dress had been torn into strips and used for bandages, rags, and grease traps. Cora now wore a pair of Caleb's canvas trousers, cinched at the waist with a length of rope, and a heavy wool shirt that swallowed her frame. Her hands were no longer soft. The burn had healed into an ugly, puckered scar across her palm, and calluses had hardened at the base of her fingers from chopping wood and hauling water. She smelled like wood smoke, pine resin, and sweat. She had never felt cleaner. The snow had begun to retreat, leaving behind a violently muddy earth. The sound of the mountain had shifted from the howling wind to the constant, rushing roar of snowmelt filling the creeks. The train was due at noon. Caleb had carried her carpet bag down the trail. They walked in silence, the mud sucking at their boots with every step. The descent was easier than the climb, but the air between them felt infinitely heavier. Over the past 3 weeks, they hadn't spoken of her leaving. They hadn't spoken of much at all. They fell into a rhythm of brutal, quiet survival. She cooked. He hunted. They sat on opposite ends of the porch in the evenings, watching the sun sink behind the jagged peaks. She learned the sound of his footsteps. He learned how she liked her coffee black, boiled hard, with a pinch of salt to kill the bitterness. When they reached the platform at Oakhaven, the depot was exactly as desolate as it had been the day she arrived. The station master, Miller, was sweeping the boardwalk. He stopped, leaning on his broom, and stared at Cora. He didn't recognize her, not until he saw the carpet bag. Well, I'll be damned, Miller spat, a look of genuine shock crossing his face. You lived. Caleb ignored him. He walked to the edge of the platform and dropped the carpet bag. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He tossed it onto the bag. It hit the canvas with the unmistakable clink of silver coins. For money, Caleb said. He didn't look at her. He looked down the empty tracks, his jaw set like carved granite. Enough for a ticket back to New York, and a room when you get there. Cora stared at the pouch. Her chest tightened, a sharp ache expanding behind her ribs. She had thought, in the quiet moments by the fire, that he might ask her to stay. Not with a declaration of love. Caleb Jessup didn't know the language of romance, but perhaps with a nod. A gruff request for someone to keep the stove lit. But he was a man who expected everyone to leave. His mother had left. His father had driven him away. He was giving her the silver because he believed she was already gone. In the distance, the low, mournful blast of a steam whistle echoed down the valley. The train was coming. I don't know anyone in New York anymore, Cora said, her voice dropping into the quiet space between them. You don't know anyone here, Caleb countered, his tone harsh, except a dead man and a ghost. I know how to skin a rabbit, she said. Caleb finally turned his head. His pale eyes locked onto hers, searching her face for the punchline, for the manipulation. He found neither. He found only the raw, stubborn chin of a woman who had survived his mountain and decided she didn't want to go back to the concrete. The train rounded the bend, blowing a massive cloud of black smoke into the pristine blue sky. The ground beneath the wooden platform began to vibrate. The winter gets colder, Caleb warned. his voice straining over the mechanical roar of the approaching engine. The snow drifts up to the roof. You don't see the sun for a month. I've lived in the dark before, Cora yelled back. She reached down, picked up the leather pouch of silver, and shoved it back into the front pocket of his elk-hide coat. Her knuckles brushed against his chest. His heart was beating furiously, a wild, frantic rhythm beneath the heavy wool. The train screeched to a halt, iron grinding against iron in an ear-splitting wail. The doors opened. A conductor stepped out, looking expectantly at the platform. Caleb looked at the train. He looked at the silver in his pocket. Then, he looked at Cora. The rigid, defensive posture he had worn like armor for 30 years suddenly cracked. He let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a surrender. He didn't pull her into a cinematic embrace. He didn't kiss her. He simply reached down, picked up her carpet bag, and turned his back on the train. I need to buy flour, Caleb said gruffly, walking toward the general store. Cora watched his broad shoulders retreat. A small, genuine smile broke across her face, cracking the dirt on her cheek. Wait for me, she called out, stepping off the platform and sinking her boots back into the mountain mud. If this gritty, slow-burn frontier story struck a chord, make sure to hit that like button. Cora and Caleb's journey proves that survival isn't always pretty, but finding someone who understands your scars is worth the struggle. Share this video with a friend who loves raw, realistic historical drama, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, immersive storytelling. Drop a comment below. Would you have stayed on the mountain? See you in the next one.
Hi, my name is Talem, the owner and manager of Mountain Man's Secrets. After watching the video, no one came for the mail-order bride, then a mountain man's son changed everything. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was how one small act of kindness completely changed the direction of her life. Sometimes children see honesty and goodness long before adults do. Do you think she would have stayed if that little boy hadn't reached out to her first? If this story touched you too, feel free to leave a comment and share your thoughts. And if you enjoy emotional mountain stories about family, healing, and second chances, you can like or subscribe to support the channel.
Hi, my name is William Sunny, the owner and manager of Iron Cowboy Gardena. After watching the video, father sent his no one came for the mail-order bride, then a mountain man's son changed everything. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me was the feeling of unexpected hope. Cora arrived believing she was stepping into one future, only to discover it no longer existed. Yet through hardship, hard work, and an unlikely connection, she found a completely different path. Sometimes the people who change our lives aren't the ones we plan to meet at all. One gentle lesson from this story is that new beginnings don't always arrive the way we imagine. They can come through challenges, patience, and learning to trust what's right in front of us. Do you think Cora made the right choice by staying on the mountain? And what moment in the story made you feel that Caleb's view of her was beginning to change? In everyday life, it's worth remembering that setbacks can sometimes lead us toward opportunities we never expected. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these Mountain Man stories, feel free to like the video or subscribe to Iron Cowboy Gardena for more journeys filled with resilience, second chances, and human connection.